Senator Moore.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I've spoken in this place before about my friend Mohammed Sajjapour, an Australian citizen of Iranian descent, who advocates strongly for a group of people who are trapped in Iraq at a place called Camp Liberty. A misnomer, if ever there was one, Mr Acting Deputy President. There are about 3,000 people, Iranian people, who are all members of the People's Mojahedin organisation of Iran. And they've been trapped at the Camp Liberty near Baghdad airport after they transferred from Camp Ashraf in December 2011 through February 2012. This group of people include around 1,000 women and children who have all been classified as asylum seekers by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. But while they're trapped in that area, are subject to regular missile attacks and harassment from the Iraqi government. The fear of the people at Camp Liberty, Mr Acting Deputy President, is that somehow they will be forcibly returned to Iran. They left Iran because they'd fallen out with the then government and have lived in Iraq for a number of years, under the protection of the Iraqi government of the time and also under the protection of the UN. Mr Acting Deputy President, we know about the human rights record of Iran. Amnesty International, who puts out regular bulletins, talk about the severe restrictions on freedoms of expression, association and assembly. Dissidents and human rights defenders, including minority rights and women's rights activists, are arbitrarily arrested, detained, imprisoned after unfair trials and banned from travelling abroad. There are scores of prisoners of conscience and political prisoners. Many people don't know where family members have gone after they've been subject to arrest. We know that there's torture and other ill treatment, and we know that there's a particular focus on stopping freedom of expression in the community. We also know that the judicial punishments of flogging and amputation continue to be used. But, Mr Acting Deputy President, what is most appalling and what always horrifies me are the statistics around executions that take place in Iran. We don't even know the absolute figures. The records provided by the Iranian government are clearly inaccurate because we know from information that's smuggled out of the country and also discussed freely with the community that the numbers are much higher. The total number of executions in Iran in 2014 up to May 5th is, we believe, around 280, with only about 100 of those being announced publicly by the regime. Most of the people who are executed are political prisoners, and there's a clear policy of rapid execution, including public executions, to instil fear in the society. And we know that the Iranian society is undergoing a severe economic and political crisis. Mr Acting Deputy President, all that data is publicly known, and sometimes when you receive information from Amnesty and even from people who come to visit you, it almost begins to be an academic exercise. But the last time Mohammed came to see me, I had expected him to see me regularly because he comes to talk about what's happening for the people in Camp Liberty. But when he came to see me last time, he was talking specifically about one prisoner in Iran, about whom he was very fearful. The gentleman about whom he was talking was Mr Gholamrez Kozavi Sarajini, who was at that time transferred from the area he'd been held into an area which we knew was where people went just before they were executed. Mohammed was telling me about Mr Kozavi, who was 49. He has one child, and we had photographs of him with his kid actually playing soccer. And Mr Acting Deputy President, at this time when we're all looking at the World Cup, many of us losing sleep at night watching that, somehow seeing the photograph of this father and son together on a soccer field was something that was very familiar. But what we found out after the time that we'd heard about the fact that he'd been transferred, we discovered that he had been executed. The reality of just this one case, where Mohammed was talking to me about what the background of this gentleman was, the fact that he had been condemned to death on the charge of Mojahedin, which is enmity towards God. He had been condemned to death on the April 21st, 2012 for making a donation to support the cable TV service of the People's Mojahedin organisation of Iran. Acting Deputy President, making a donation to a group, a political group, an enemy of the state, was actually caused capital punishment. And I think amidst all the discussions, the theory of the process, to find out the history of this one man was particularly confronting, and it made all the theories and all the figures become very real. And what we know is that this is a daily occurrence in this nation. And we have figures that say that it is increasing, that there are more executions taking place, all at the time when publicly, internationally, we're talking about a more compassionate regime, a new way of operating in Iran. But, Mr. Acting Deputy President, these horrific human rights attacks continue to occur. Within this environment, we hear about the group of people who are still trapped in Camp Liberty. They have been assessed by the UNHCR, but as I said, there are about 3,000 people in that establishment, but only 300 have been relocated to safe third world countries, almost 100 to Germany, which has a very strong record in this area, and about 200 to Albania. We have not taken or forwarded any action to actually take people from this camp to Australia, even though we know that they have family and friends here who are desperately seeking their safety and being able to support them. Mr. Acting Deputy President, on June 27 this year, there will be a huge rally in Paris to advocate for democracy in Iran. This is an annual event. It will be attended, we believe, by over 120,000 people, if attendances of recent years can give you any indication. Among them will be hundreds of members of parliaments, mainly from Europe, North America and Middle East, and people who are concerned about making sure there's a public statement about human rights and democracy in Iran. We know that there are issues. We have people in our community who understand these things, who have friends and family caught up in this horror. We cannot pretend that this is not happening. We know that there's actually a massive sentiment for democratic change among Iranian people. And at the international level, the President-elect of the Council of Resistance of Iran, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, continues to speak out in Europe, calling for democracy in her homeland of Iran. Mr. Acting Deputy President, we're not talking about telling other countries how they should run their business. What we're talking about is understanding the clear principles of democracy and human rights. There is evidence to say that the regime in Iran is not effectively promoting human rights within their community. Simply the stories about the regular executions are enough to say that this is not what we expect from a country that is having an effective democracy. Mr. Acting Deputy President, concerns me that our country is now beginning to enter into enhanced trade agreements with Iran. I think it's really important that we do have interaction. I think it's important for our country to ensure that we can best look after our own primary producers, because most of this is about the live export trade. But nonetheless, within this interchange, there should be some space to talk about our expectation that other nations have similar approaches to human rights and democratic practice as we do, if we are going to be involved in commercial exchange. Mr. Acting Deputy President, I think Australia has a role to play. We were active in the Iraqi conflict, and we know that horror is continuing to occur in that nation now. So we had this group of people who are seeking asylum in Iraq, where the Iraqi situation is degenerating so quickly, even as we speak. So I again put the case towards our Australian government and our community. We should talk with the people who are in the Camp Liberty, as it's well known. We should make sure that our embassy officials visit that camp and talk to the people directly. We should ensure that there is some understanding of their genuine asylum status, and we work towards making sure that not more people, like the gentleman who was executed quite recently, will be victims of a regime that is one to which there is very little similarity or links with our current nation.